All right, today we are going to talk about the actual text of the book of Ezra. In the earlier lectures, we covered a lot of the introductory information and things that are important to understand as background material. But today we want to look at the actual text. And the book of Ezra begins where the book of 2nd Chronicles ends. The book of 2nd Chronicles ends with the description of the decree of Cyrus of Persia that he would allow the displaced peoples in his kingdom to go back to their ancestral homes, to rebuild their cities and their temples. The book of Ezra then begins with a reference to that same decree. It begins, in the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. The Lord stirred up the spirit of the Cyrus king of Persia so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. It's really interesting that Ezra begins by referencing Jeremiah, because Jeremiah is the prophet who specifically said that the Jews would be in exile for 70 years, that they would serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. One of the more technical issues of Jeremiah's prophecy is trying to determine exactly how that 70 years is to be calculated. There are several possibilities, and Jeremiah in his predictions did not give a particular starting point or a particular ending point. What he gives us is just the statement that the people of Israel and the nations will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. So there's a couple of actually more than a couple of options that we might want to consider. And while several biblical texts tell us that the period of exile is 70 years, there remains this difficulty of actually figuring out how the computation is supposed to work. So one of the options that would be the one that most people would probably think of first is from the fall of Jerusalem, when the temple was destroyed, until the decree of Cyrus, when the people of Judah are allowed to come back to Babylon. Jerusalem fell in 586 BC. That's a pretty well-established date. Some scholars might say 587. Most would say 586. But regardless, that's a fairly tight date. And the decree of Cyrus that they could return to their homelands was made in 539, right after the fall of the city of Babylon. So the distance between the fall of Jerusalem and the decree of Cyrus is only about 47 or 48 years. That's too short for those to be the beginning point and the ending point of the 70 years. So that means that we really need to look for other possibilities if we're going to satisfy this prediction. Another option might be looking particularly at the deportation of Daniel and the deportation of the young men that came to Babylon in 605. After the change of loyalty of Jehoiakim from Egypt to Babylon, Daniel and the three young men that are described in the book of Daniel, as well as a number of other young men from Judah, were sent to Babylon to learn and be educated in the Babylonian system. Now, they weren't deported as prisoners of war, such as you would have later, but they did make this trip to Babylon. And if we use that as a starting date, which is 605 BC, and we go down to the decree of Cyrus that they could return, which is in 539, you have then a period of 66 years. Well, that's not quite 70, but it's certainly getting closer. So because it's not quite 70, there are a couple of other options to consider. One is considering the option of when Jehoahaz, one of the kings of Judah, was taken in exile to Egypt, and his son Jehoiakim becomes a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar shortly after that. And that would take us back to 609 BC until the decree of Cyrus. And that period of time would in fact be 70 years. So that is very, very close. Just pretty much bang on in terms of the number of years that are needed to satisfy Jeremiah's prophecy. But that particular decree is a little ambiguous on the beginning point, because it starts with Jehoiakim as a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar, and maybe that has to do with serving the king of Babylon, but the people of Judah are not, at least as a whole, are not at that time deported, even though that is the beginning of the first deportation. So there is another option that sometimes people look at, and it has to do with the destruction of the first temple and the completion of the second temple. The first temple was destroyed when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the city in 586 BC. The second temple was completed in 516 BC in the book of Ezra. And that computation also comes out to 70 years. So of the options that you see on the slide, option 1 and option 2 don't seem to be very good options. Option 3 and option 4 are better options. They come out to just exactly the 70 years that is needed to satisfy Jeremiah's prediction. So when you open the book of Ezra, in the very first verse, you read that this fulfillment of the decree of Cyrus has to do with Jeremiah's prediction. Probably you're looking at option 3 or option 4. In this decree, Cyrus recognizes Yahweh as the God of heaven. He speaks of Yahweh, the God of heaven. And that might sound like Cyrus was a worshiper of Yahweh. But I'm not sure that you should make too much of that. First of all, Cyrus is a Persian. He's a polytheist. He is a worshiper of many gods. And so it's not difficult for him to add a god to the list of gods that he already serves. So when he speaks of Yahweh as the God of heaven, it's not very likely that he is talking about Yahweh as exclusively God in the way that the Hebrews would. That language is probably simply religious protocol. Cyrus is a diplomat, if you wish. He knows how to use language in ways that is pleasing to people. And so even though he probably recognizes the various other gods and goddesses of other peoples, as well as Babylon, as well as his own Persian Empire, he would recognize the God of the Israelites. This seems to be the way that the statement is made on the Cyrus cylinder, this cylinder that we looked at in the previous lecture. Similarly, in the book of Isaiah, Cyrus is described by several very elevated titles that make you might suppose he was a worshiper of Yahweh, and probably the one that is the most striking is that he is called the Anointed of Yahweh, quite literally the Messiah of Yahweh. Now, he is not obviously the Messiah in the sense of Jesus, but he would be a figure that would be a deliverer of the Jews, and in some sense, then, he is a Messiah. But in spite of that, in the book of Isaiah, it also says, very, very specifically, Yahweh says about Cyrus that he does not know me. So, even though Cyrus is using this language of Yahweh, the God of heaven, in the beginning of the book of Ezra, I doubt that you should take this to mean that he is a worshiper of Yahweh. Yahweh himself says, Cyrus does not know me, and that seems to be a very clear statement. The Edict of Cyrus appears in the book of Ezra in two forms. There is this form at the beginning of the book in chapter 1, which is in Hebrew, and this is probably the form of the decree that was announced to the Jewish community of exiles in Babylon. Later, in chapter 6, we're going to find an Aramaic form of this same decree. The Aramaic form is probably the official statement of the decree as it was recorded in the Persian archives. And that in turn is probably why it is in Aramaic and not in the Hebrew language. We also note that Cyrus consigned to the Jews that are going to return to Jerusalem all of those temple vessels that had been plundered by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar had brought from the Jerusalem temple many of the sacred objects from the temple, and we read in the book of Daniel how that Belshazzar, the son of Nabonidus, Belshazzar, who was the regent of the city of Babylon, used those very vessels in an elaborate festival for his nobles and his leaders, really on the night that Babylon would fall. And they're drinking wine out of these sacred vessels of the temple. This is the night that the handwriting came on the wall in the book of Daniel in chapter 5 that said this will be the end of the Persian, or the end of the Babylonian kingdom. So all of these sacred vessels have been given to the Jews to take back with them as they go back to rebuild the temple. And this is really a sign of generosity on the part of Cyrus. He is doing his best to make the people in his kingdom happy. And you'll also notice in the book of Ezra that something happens which happened long ago in the time of the Exodus. When the Israelites came out of Egypt in the Exodus, If you read carefully in Exodus 11 and 12, you'll find that the Egyptians actually gave to the Israelites gifts that they could have for their own, that they could take with them and help supply their needs on their way. And now the same thing happens in Babylon. The Babylonians give to the Jews many gifts that they can take from Babylon back to Jerusalem. So in a sense, this is a way of describing the return from Babylon to Jerusalem as kind of a second exodus. The first exodus is from Egypt to the land of Canaan. The second exodus is now from Babylon back to Jerusalem. When you read the rather, for most people I suppose, somewhat uninteresting list of the vessels in the inventory, if you're interested in mathematics, you might realize that the cited number of the total, which is 5,400, that when you add up the incremental parts that are in chapter 1 of Ezra, they don't add up to 5,400. They only add up to 2,499. And it may occur to you, why is there this discrepancy in the listings? If you add up all the small parts, they don't add up to the total at the end. And ironically, if you read the book of 1st Esdras, which you'll remember from previous lecture that 1st Esdras is the book in the Apocrypha that addresses the same material as the book of Ezra, you'll find a list there, and that list is in fact very self-consistent. All of the pieces add up to the total at the end, and they add up to 5,469. Now, the difference between 5,469 and 5,400 is really the difference between one that is rounded off and one that is more specific. And sometimes you will find those figures in English translations of the book of Ezra. And I'll give you an example. That would be the Revised Standard Version, which is a widely used English version of the Bible. In the Revised Standard Version, the list that you find in the book of Ezra does not come from the Hebrew Masoretic text. Rather, it comes from the text of 1st Esdras, which is a self-consistent list. And that would leave you with a list without any discrepancies. On the other hand, other versions of the Bible, say for instance the English Standard Version or the New American Standard Bible or other Bibles like that, will leave the discrepancy as it is, and you'll have to figure that out as best you can. The reason for the discrepancy is not clear, but let me offer a couple of suggestions. Some interpreters suggest that the reason that the adding of the vessels do not add up to the 5,400 is that only the most important of the vessels were itemized, and then the rest were just unitemized. So the fact that if you add up the list that adds up to 2,499, if you add that up, all you're doing is adding up the list of the most important of the vessels, and then the other vessels are just added in to create the final figure of 5,400. The other suggestion is that there may have been a textual corruption in the transmission of the numbers through the centuries in the Masoretic text. And that is possible. Numbers are difficult to transcribe in Hebrew in the sense that there were no Arabic numbers at this time, so we're used to using Arabic numbers in a pretty precise way. But in the ancient world, in written text, numbers are written out as words. Very similar to the way you might write a bank check, and you might write numbers in one part, but in the other part you have to write out the words of the numbers, like 4,292 or whatever the number happens to be. That kind of writing is often difficult to transmit without making a mistake or dropping a number, and we have a number of places in the Hebrew text of the Bible where we think that maybe there has been a problem in the transmission of numbers. So this is another suggestion as to why the list may not be consistent in itself. But other than that, we really don't know why this discrepancy has occurred in the first chapter of Ezra. One item of the temple that never came back is the Ark of the Covenant. I think I mentioned that in a previous lecture. The sacred Ark disappears at this point and will never be seen again. Now, there are different theories, as I briefly mentioned before, concerning the disappearance of the Ark of the Covenant. In the Jewish Talmud, which is the collection of Jewish traditions that was collected, actually two collections of the Talmud. There is the Babylonian Talmud and the Palestinian Talmud. But in any case, in the Talmud, it specifically states that the ark was not in the Second Temple. Occasionally you might hear a sermon, perhaps, in a church where a pastor might try to describe the Ark of the Covenant in the temple in the time of Jesus. Well, it's very well intentioned, but it's just not true. There was no ark in the temple in the time of Jesus. There was no ark in the temple after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. And even though the Jews would rebuild the Second Temple, there would be no ark in that temple. The ark then is not mentioned in the list of temple vessels taken to Babylon. And in fact, if you look carefully at a passage in Jeremiah 3:16, you will discover that Jeremiah predicted that after that ark would be gone, no one would build a second one. One Jewish tradition as to what happened to the ark is that it was hidden during the kingship of Josiah. And so this is also found in the Talmud of Jewish traditions. It just says that during the kingship of Josiah, it was hidden in its place. Well, what does in its place mean? That's a very ambiguous kind of place. It's a term that we can't be very specific about. So we don't really know what that means. In 2nd Maccabees, Jeremiah is said to have hidden it on Mount Nebo, where Moses died. This would be in the Transjordan down near the Dead Sea. You'll find this in 2nd Maccabees chapter 2. So there's another tradition about what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. If Jeremiah actually did hide it in Mount Nebo, no one has ever found it anyway. So if you want to really be famous, you go down to Mount Nebo and see if you can discover it. I suppose people have been looking for it there for hundreds of years, so good luck. But anyway, that is an ancient tradition. And then there is one that is maybe even more bizarre. It's an Ethiopian tradition that dates back to around the 6th to the 9th centuries AD in an Ethiopian text that says that the Ark of the Covenant was actually brought to Ethiopia by the son of Solomon, who had a son by the Queen of Sheba. So in this particular scenario, the Queen of Sheba, who came from such a long ways away to see the wisdom of Solomon, at least in this story, actually has a child by Solomon who fathers a son, and this son is supposed to have taken the ark to Ethiopia. No one knows, of course, in the movie The Raiders of the Lost Ark, we have this very imaginative movie that the ark was discovered by the famous archaeologist Indiana Jones, who is, of course, a fictitious figure, and now is in some federal warehouse somewhere, and the identification number's been lost. So that's all just kind of fun stuff, and a lot of people enjoyed the movie, but of course, historically speaking, it has no real basis. Now, the leaders of the Jews that are going to bring this first wave, and actually we should think of the people coming back from Babylon to Jerusalem as in 3 waves, but this will be the first wave. The leaders of the returning Jews are going to be the governor by the name of Sheshbazzar. He is the leader of the initial return, and accompanying him will be 4 other names that are very important in the early part of the book of Ezra. One of them is Zerubbabel, and by the way, this is a Babylonian name, Zerubbabel. He also is called a governor. Then there is Joshua, that's a Hebrew name, he's the high priest. And then there are 2 prophets, one by the name of Haggai and the other by the name of Zechariah. And both of them are mentioned in the book of Ezra a couple of times. Plus, later in the Old Testament, we actually have the sermons of these 2 prophets. These are the characters that come to rebuild the temple. And this is the first wave of those who come back from Babylon to Jerusalem. Following them, we will have a second wave that comes with Ezra the priest. Ezra is a priest and a scribe, and he is going to come from Babylon some years later, and he will be the one who enacts a great deal of spiritual reform in the land of Judah and in the refugees that have returned to Jerusalem. And then even later, there will be a third wave that will come under the leadership of Nehemiah, who is also called the governor. And he will be responsible for rebuilding the walls and securing the safety of the city of Jerusalem. Now here's a mystery, the mystery of Sheshbazzar. Though Sheshbazzar is cited as the leader of the returning group, and you find that right there in the first chapter of Ezra, his name is not in the list of those who returned that is given in chapter 2. And that immediately raises for us the question, what happened to him? Where did he go? Furthermore, as you work your way through the early chapters of the book of Ezra, chapter 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, the primary leader that is talked about is not Sheshbazzar, but is Zerubbabel. And Sheshbazzar just kind of disappears. It doesn't say where he went. It doesn't say why his name is not mentioned. It just isn't used anymore. So even though Sheshbazzar is named twice later in the book, in chapter 5, it's as a memory of someone who is back much earlier. So both Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel are named as leaders in laying the foundation for the second temple, but Sheshbazzar's name disappears from the record. There are two suggestions about why this might be. One is that perhaps Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel are the same person, but there are two names for them. We certainly know that there are a number of occasions in the Bible where people had more than one name. Even Daniel, in the book of Daniel, has more than one name. His Hebrew name is Daniel, but his Babylonian name is Belteshazzar. The three young men, Mishael and Azariah and Hananiah, they have names called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they have two names. So some have suggested that maybe Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel are in fact the same person. So when the name Sheshbazzar ceases to appear, we're still talking about the same man when we're talking about Zerubbabel. However, most scholars actually do not accept that opinion. Rather, most scholars believe that Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel were two different persons, and that Sheshbazzar, for reasons that are unknown to us, disappears from the record. Perhaps he died. Perhaps he went back to Babylon. We don't really know. But nonetheless, most scholars conclude that they are two distinct persons, and that is partly based upon the book 1st Esdras in the Apocrypha. Because in the book of 1st Esdras, which is in the Apocrypha, it does seem to treat Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel as two different people. In fact, it seems to indicate that Sheshbazzar arrived first in Jerusalem and Zerubbabel came slightly later. Sheshbazzar also is commissioned by Cyrus in the book of Ezra, but Zerubbabel seems to be working under the commission of Darius, which are two different Persian emperors. So for those reasons, a lot of scholars conclude that even though Sheshbazzar's name disappears from the record, he's not the same as the man Zerubbabel. There is also one other factor that might be important, and that is in the genealogical records in 1 Chronicles 3. There is a figure there by the name of Shenazar in chapter 3 and verse 18. And if Shenazar is the same as Sheshbazzar, and one reason some scholars think so is because both of those forms, Shenazar and Sheshbazzar, go back to a single Babylonian type name. If that's true, then Zerubbabel would have been Sheshbazzar's nephew. So even though they came at about the same time, they may have been related to each other, they are not the same person. So with some of those more technical details discussed, we need to continue looking at the initial return and the people that came back. So let's talk a little bit about the registration list, which is in chapter 2. In the very beginning in chapter 2, there is a listing in verse 2 of 11 names. To those 11 names, we probably ought to add a 12th name, Nahamani, because Nahamani is listed in Nehemiah 7:7 as one of the early leaders, and all of the other names are in Nehemiah 7:7. Plus, 12 names are in the book of 1st Esdras in chapter 5, and those are the same 12 names. So it would seem that in some way that we're not sure about, one of the names got dropped out of Ezra chapter 2 and verse 2. But originally there were 12 major leaders. And that would make sense because the Israelites, of course, for them the number 12 is a very sacred number. It's the number of the 12 tribes. It's the number of the sons of Jacob. And so the 12 leaders that came with Zerubbabel probably symbolize the traditional number of the clans of Israel. It seems unlikely that a couple of those names are people that we will meet later, even though the names are the same. When you read those 12 names, you're going to see two names that might immediately jump out at you. One of them is Nehemiah, but this can hardly be the Nehemiah of the book of Nehemiah, because that would be severely anachronistic. And the other one is the name Mordecai. Mordecai comes up in the book of Esther and is Esther's uncle, but he is probably not one of those who came back to Jerusalem. In the list, there are several kinds of people. There are pure Israelites, those people who could actually demonstrate their pedigree, their genealogy, or in some way connect themselves to the ancient past in a very direct way. There were those with unclear status. These would be people who claimed to be Jewish. They claimed that they were part of the people of Israel, but they couldn't actually prove it. So they didn't have the record of their pedigree, and so they are given probationary status. They're going to try to validate their claim by the Urim and the Thummim. These are and I'll talk about those in a moment, these two mediums by which they find answers out from God. And among those with unclear status would be not only people who couldn't prove their pedigree, but people who claimed to be in the priesthood but could not in any particular way prove that they were in the priesthood. We'll close this lecture by talking about the Urim and the Thummim, these two ancient implements that were stored in the breastplate of the high priest. This goes all the way back to the book of Exodus. These implements were used to inquire about God's will at various junctures, and we don't know exactly what they were. They're named in a number of passages, but they're never described. And so there are a couple of theories, I guess you'd say, about what they were. One comes from Flavius Josephus, who says that they were some kind of gemstones in which light passed through the gemstones and gave some sort of answer to questions. And the other is based on a passage in the Septuagint in 1 Samuel where they seem to produce unclear answers, and this would be a form of casting lots, sort of like if you had two rocks, if you will, and this is an illustration, this is not what they actually were, but if you had two rocks and they have X's on one side and O's on the other, and you cast them, they could come up with either the options of two O's, two X's, or an X and an O. If it's two X's, it's a yes answer. If it's a two O's, it's a no answer. If it's X and O, it's unclear. So many scholars think that the Urim and the Thummim were some sort of lot casting implement similar to that, and that these were used to establish the legitimacy of those who had unclear pedigrees. Those coming back from Babylon to Jerusalem, many of them had, in the time that they lived in Babylon, become relatively wealthy. Now that may seem a surprise since these are exiles, but in fact Jeremiah had written a letter to the exiles in Babylon and instructed them that they should make a home there, they should find work there, they should find a way to make a living and become prosperous, and apparently many of them did. The gifts that they brought back with them demonstrate some of their wealth, and they're offered in a couple of ways. They're offered both as coinage and as weights and then as garments. Now these are interesting commodities. First of all, coinage is very new. Coinage in the ancient world does not really go back before about the middle of the 6th century BC. Coinage seems to be created initially by the king of Sardis in Asia Minor, but the Persians apparently learned coinage from this country in Asia Minor, and they begin to adopt this as a practice. And so during the Persian Empire, they begin to produce coins called derricks. What I've shown you in this slide is the obverse and the reverse side of a derrick that was produced by Darius I in Persia in the period in the late 500s BC and the early 400s BC. So many of the people that came back from Babylon to Jerusalem brought with them this coinage, derricks, golden derricks, that they used as gifts for the temple. Others brought weights, and the more lengthy traditional way of handling exchange was to weigh out elements of gold and silver on a scale. So this is not really coinage. These are small ingots or nuggets or something like that that could be weighed on a scale. And garments, of course, would be fabrics that would be quite valuable. So people brought all of these things with them from Babylon to Jerusalem in order to give them as gifts for the rebuilding of the temple. Here is a a coin that was actually minted in Jerusalem. This is a bit later than the time that we're talking about, so this is going to be about 370 BC. It's before the time of Alexander the Great, but it's still in the Persian period. But this is actually a Jewish coin, one of the earliest Jewish coins we have. And on the right edge of the coin, it will say Yehud, which is the Aramaic consonants for the name of Judah. When you read Psalm 126 in the Old Testament, it is a psalm that reflects upon the people coming back from Babylon to Jerusalem. And this psalm begins with these words: "When the Lord brought back those who returned to Zion, we were like those who dream." All of these people coming back were dreamers. They dreamed of the fulfillment of the wonderful promises that were given by Isaiah and Jeremiah and other prophets, that the return from exile would be a return with glory. And so the psalm says, "Then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongues with shouts of joy." They came back optimistic. They came back with enthusiasm. They were coming back because they believed they were fulfilling the word of the Lord. And in all, about 50,000 people returned from Babylon to Jerusalem, which is a large, large amount. Now, when you tally up these people, the tally in Ezra is different than the one in Nehemiah chapter 7. And again, we're not sure why that discrepancy exists. Maybe that was also due to scribal transmission through the centuries, but we're not really sure. But at least there were some people that were wealthy, and they gave substantial gifts for the building project. One of the more interesting artifacts that have come to light relatively recently was a stone seal, which has been dated by archaeologists to about the mid-6th to mid-5th century, and it has an actual name on it, Shalomit, which is the actual letters for the name of one of the returning families that are mentioned in the book of 1 Chronicles. Dr. Anson Rainey, who's the Emeritus Professor of Ancient Near Eastern Culture and Semitic Linguistics at Tel Aviv University, has examined this, and he is a professional in linguistics and ancient inscriptions, and he suggests that this seal could actually be the seal of the daughter of Zerubbabel, who's mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 3. In any case, it is one of the returning families to Jerusalem, so it's a really fascinating artifact. As we move into chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6, we move into the actual rebuilding of the Second Temple. This is the Temple Mount as it looks today. Today, the Temple Mount, of course, has as its primary architectural feature the Dome of the Rock, which is under the control of Islam. It's the place where Islamic peoples believe that Muhammad ascended into heaven, so it is a sacred site for them. But the Dome of the Rock is on approximately the same place where the ancient temple was built. Now, the fact is, we don't know exactly where the second temple was built or where the first temple was built on the top of this mountain. All we can do is do some speculation, largely based upon ancient references in the Talmud and things like that. We do know that this site was purchased by David from Aruna the Jebusite, and you find that described in the books of Kings and Chronicles. David purchased this site, and the first temple was built by Solomon there, and then when the Babylonians destroyed that temple, now Zerubbabel is going to come back and presumably build the second temple as closely as possible on the site where the first temple was. So even though we can't locate it with absolute precision, we know approximately this is the place where the second temple would have been built. Probably the reigning theory among a number of theories about this is the one by archaeologist Lean Rittmeyer, who has done a lot of extensive work in this area, and he suggests that the rock in the Dome of the Rock is in fact where the most holy place was in the second temple. Not everybody agrees with Dr. Rittmeyer, but it is a fascinating way of looking at it, and if you want to follow his articles, you will find them in archaeological magazines such as Biblical Archaeology Review.